speaker is Dr. Anindita Ghosh. She's from Manchester, and she's basically going to speak about Bengali language, how it was developed in the 19th century. So I'm going to pass this on to her and come back to chair when she finishes her presentation. Thank you.
Right. Firstly, I must explain the slides. There are these weird notes at the end. I'm not going to sing this through, but I think this has happened because they look like musical notes, don't they? But that's because of the version of, I'm told, the PowerPoint here, which can't quite read all of my characters. So this is going to be stage prose, I'm afraid, no singing involved. Right, it's lovely to be here, and it's wonderful to be able to talk about the Bengali language, which I think is so central to all of our hearts. It is a part of my wider project, which has been about the social history of the Bengali language in colonial Bengal, which of course covers both modern-day Bangladesh and modern-day West Bengal. And I looked at different strategies of the shaping of literary tastes, standardization of language, and the burgeoning print industry of the time, so a whole range of print publications. But my particular interest was in Bottola, which is a very a special term and a very specialized concept for those of you who are not familiar with this. This is basically kind of chapbook literature being produced in the northern part of colonial Calcutta, full of a range of works from erotic stuff to even school textbooks. So it has been very understudied and underrepresented in historical studies. And I wanted to look at that in particular to see, and this was a prodigious printing and publishing industry in the second half of the 19th century that was going on in Calcutta, and Bottola was at the heart of this. And I wanted to see what, this big, it's a sea of books really that was being produced there, as to what this was doing as a counterpoint to Bhadralok refined literature of the period. And what I found actually totally amazed me, and when I started this project I didn't know what I would find. I was literally just groping in the darkness. But it is amazing to see how there was a whole body of literature that acted as a counterpoint to what was being produced by the educated westernized, with the self-image of the refined Bhadralok. And how this did so well, and this was basically a print industry which had its consumers within the low middle classes of society, who were very different from my educated groups. And as part of the project, and this is where this paper comes from, as part of the process, of course, I also looked at what was happening with the Bengali language. So you find very different literary strands. So the Bhadralok are consuming one kind of Bengali, but the Bottola literature is about a totally different kind of Bengali, which has to do with the colloquial, the folk, and so on. And I found that the three strands that the refined literature targeted were the colloquial, to begin with. There was also something known as Meli Bhasha, or women's language, and these were literally terms coming out of colonial records. I'm not making that up. And the third strand with which I was also interested was Musalmani Bangla. And that is what concerns us today to a certain extent. How did a certain kind of Bengali come to be defined and shaped by scholars, both European and Bengali, around the period beginning 1800 and slightly before that, and how this Bengali separated its way from a very different language that it had been earlier. And I argue that this is because of a very artificial process of Sanskritization of the Bengali language that happened from around the end of the 18th century. So to get to what I want to talk about today, and to also introduce you to my book, which was published by the Oxford University Press in 2006. And what I'll be sharing with you today is part of that book. But really, I also talk about a lot of other things in the book, and I've just explained my bigger project to you. So the 19th century and 1800 is literally the date when you have the first Bengali printing press set up in Serampore. And this is also therefore a very significant date for us in terms of what was happening to the Bengali language. So the 19th century witnessed the evolution of Bengali as a modern prose language in print literature, when dominant norms were being laid down to standardize and control what had been a flexible and regionalized dialect. The rapid progress of standardization and Sanskritization of the vernacular through the programs of the Fort William College, and we will soon be seeing what that institution did, early school book societies and missionaries was carried through in the activities of the literary clubs and societies and newspapers of the period set up by the Bengali intelligentsia. These are the Padulok that I have been talking about. The written Sanskritic character of the new print language combined with it an unabashedly Hindu stance. An increasing number of scholars have described how an artificial purification, within quotes of course, of the Bengali language and the attempt to get rid of naturalized Perso-Arabic words from its active vocabulary made for a separation between a seemingly purer Sanskritized Shadhu style and its lesser Islamic variant. And this is what comes to be known as Musalmani Bangla. The distinction that thus resulted marked out two separate styles. One was the standard Bengali, generally marked by a fair percentage of Tatsama or Totshama or Sanskrit loan words, and the other was Musalmani Bengali, distinguished by its dominant Perso-Arabic content, identifiable with Hindus and Muslims respectively. So the Totshama Sanskritized language were identified with Hindus, and the Musalmani Bengali was identified with Muslims. Such communalization of the once shared vernacular adds an interesting cultural dimension to studies on the political mobilization of Muslims and Hindus in 19th century Bengal. Okay, and these are the key players that we have up here. The Fort William College is set up in 1800 to train the bureaucrats of the East India Company, and they have to be trained in the local vernacular so that it makes it easy for them to administer. The Bengali Hindu Pundits are an inevitable part of this project, and they help the European scholars understand and learn the Bengali language. So Bengali scholars and officials of European origin, both together, are part of this project. Missionaries, of course, are also very important, and missionaries, as we shall soon see, have a very important role to play in the Fort William College itself, particularly in the person of William Carey. But missionaries are also important because they're experimenting with the language at the same time for very different reasons, of course, for reasons of proselytization, because so that they can translate the Christian texts into Bengali and thereby proselytize the Bengali population. So they have their own interests in the Bengali language. Of course, educationists, and you have the school book societies, a host of which come up again in the early part of the 19th century. Okay. So what then is the difference between this standard Bengali that I've been talking about and Musalmani Bangla? In 1778, Halhed, N.B. Halhed, or Nathaniel Brassey Halhed, writes the Grammar of the Bengali Language. This is the first ever Bengali printed book, and this is also the first ever Bengali grammar. And he calls this language debased. And Halhed has a very important role to play in the standardization process with his Bengali grammar, which is an extremely influential text for the future of the language and shapes its destiny. 1855, Reverend James Long is also an extremely important person in this debate, and he's the one actually who coins this term. He's the one who coins this term, Musalmani Bengali. And he says this is chiefly the language of fictional works lacking in taste and read by Muslim boatmen. And this is actually from his, this is within quotes of course, and this is from his very influential report that he publishes on vernacular publications, which is in the mid-19th century. And in 1879, and you can see through those dates how the same idea continues and it comes to being printed indelibly upon the linguistic horizon. C.W. Bolton, who is also a very important official of the time, in his report on vernacular publications in 1879, even hesitated to call it a language. And without a grammar or a vocabulary, he says it was, I quote, but a mongrel of Bengali and Urdu. Okay? So we already, I think, we are getting an idea of the attitudes towards what was seen as a very specific version of Bengali, which really shouldn't ever have been part of standardized Bengali. A deep-seated distrust of Muslims following 1857 and a predictable resentment towards Persian as the official language had a big role to play in this. Because of course Persian was the language of the Mughals and the previous imperial regime, so that had a fair share in shaping the attitudes towards the Perso-Arabic elements of the Bengali language. But, I argue, the predominance of Hindu Pundits and a Hindu urban intelligentsia in the formative stages of shaping the new print language contributed to and perpetuated such perceptions as well. So they had a very important role to play too. In 1884, Chandranath Bose, who was the librarian to the Bengal Library, in a routine annual report did not hesitate to trace the inaccuracies in a Bengali primer to the author's Islamic identity, saying how it was evident, and I quote, that the author is a Muslim not well acquainted with the Bengali language. And that's absolutely ridiculous. But these are the kind of ideas that are being, that are circulating and that are being promoted. The innate social and political agenda implicit in such utterances could not be clearer. Bengali, or at least Hindu Bengali, the favored language of officialdom, was for Hindus and Bengalis only, and Bengali Muslims were better staying off its bounds. Okay? I now move on to look at the specific activities of individuals connected to this project. Sorry. Not yet, that will come. So this is a very interesting text. This is Kolikata Komalalaya, which is by Bhavani Charan Bandyopadhyay, as you can see, published in 1823. And it's an extremely interesting text for us, because what it does is it shows us how language, the Bengali language, was in an extremely fluid state at this point. It is about the city, it is about the colonial city of Calcutta. It's about a lot of other things going on in the city, but it is also about a language. And what he does in this work is he poses this imaginary dialogue between a city man and a rural man about language. And seemingly, the rural man is asking the city man very, very, very probing, extremely difficult questions. And the city man has to put up, with a defense of why the Bengali language in the city has shaped up differently. So he seemed to be the spokesman for the urban Bengali language that is circulating in Calcutta in the early part of the 20th century. And so you can see from the question itself, it's obviously, it's Bhavani Charan who's posing both sides of the debate. So he's completely aware of the different issues involved here. So the rural man asks this city man, why did Sambhadrlok use so many alien words in the Bengali language? In other words, why do they use so many Perso-Arabic words? And the city man says, well, there are many Perso-Arabic and English words that do not have Sadhu Bengali substitutes, so we have to end up using them because they are, they're just very important and there aren't any good Bengali substitutes. And besides, hybrid Bengali is essential to survive in Calcutta. And of course, Bhavani Charan would be saying that because, he himself is a part of the colonial bureaucracy and he's done very well because of that. So he has to end up defending this hybrid language, which is the language of commerce of the period, which is central to the city, and the city cannot survive without this language. This is 1823, and so you can already see this is a period simultaneous to the time that these debates about language were going on in the writing of grammars and vocabularies and within official circles. And yet nothing is really said. So these are interesting simultaneous processes that are going on. But it's valuable for us to understand how this was not an easy process. This was, it isn't as if overnight Hinduized, Sanskritized Bengali came to dominate the language. There was a lot of, there were a lot of struggles, there were a lot of complexities, and a lot of fractures within that process. So the next thing that I want to take you through is actually now, by this time, I think we should be coming to Halhed. And I want to take you through the grammar of the Bengali language, and that's Halhed, of course, over there. And that is from the preface, that's the frontispiece of his book. And you can see how this was actually a bilingual text with both English and Bengali featuring there. This is published in Hooghly in 1778. The earliest moves to reform this so-called unruly language and construct a linguistic agenda of some sort came from the British administrators and missionaries. A major task for these groups was the production of appropriate grammars, lexicons, and vocabularies which you needed to standardize the language. In the first ever Bengali grammar written in 1778 and the first ever printed book in Bengali, as I've said, Halhed presented the vernacular in its, what he called, the purest form, as deriving exclusively from Sanskrit. The Bengali of his own times, he concluded, fell far below those standards. And it's interesting that he's almost swimming against the tide. So he's saying the Bengali I'm encountering is not the real Bengali. He's in search of something that doesn't exist. And in the process, he actually ends up creating what in his version is the ideal Bengali. And it will only become clearer, I hope, when we look at, this is actually very interesting. This is from the Halhed text. And those of you who can read this, and I appreciate not all of you will perhaps be able to read it, you can see by the name, it is of course written in the manuscript style to begin with, of course, that's pretty evident because it's in couplet form. But if you look at the orthography, if you look at the calligraphy, and if you look at the script itself, this is very different from the standardized Bengali that we begin to find mid-19th century onwards. Just one example is if you look at the last word of the first sentence, the last word is chule, but that's not a law, that's a no, for those of you who can follow Bengali. And that over time actually comes to be standardized into the law that we now recognize as part of the printed language. Okay, so these were the kind of uncertainties that people like Halhed encounter, and in their eagerness to prove this purer version, they standardized relentlessly and ruthlessly what is actually a very fluid language, and they standardized the orthography, the vocabulary, the grammar, and the script. So on various fronts, this standardization happens. I'd love to share with you this quote from Halhed's grammar, and this is part of his preface, and I think it's very telling. And this is what he has to say. The modern Bengali form of letters, their mode of spelling and their choice of words are all equally erroneous and absurd. So this is an Englishman telling a Bengali how Bengali should be written. They can neither decline a word nor construct a sentence, and their writings are filled with Persian, Arabic, and Hindustanic terms, promiscuously thrown together without order and meaning, often embarrassing and obscure. They seldom separate the several words of a sentence from each other or conclude a period with a stop. Of course, all of this, as we know subsequently, was introduced into the Bengali language. Halhed Khaled's working papers for his grammar clearly demonstrate how he was replacing a wide variety of alphabetical and orthographic representation with a standardized orthography. And in one of his working papers, and this is in the British Library and I've looked at this, if you look at his working papers and if you look at the annotations in the margins of his working papers, it's very interesting to see how he's constantly changing what is being suggested by his munshi, and he had a munshi helping him. And it's very clear in other works, and not just me, but other works have also shown how Khaled chose to discard this munshi and take on a Sanskrit Pandit into his service, because he clearly didn't like what the munshi was suggesting. And just one example of these changes that he was making. So he would collect various versions of scripts and texts from these various helpers who were working with him. And then he would come in and fine-tune what he found. And one example of this is how I found him changing the spelling of beer to beer, but it's basically based on the Sanskritic original version, veer, he thought, where beer is spelled with rashoi. Again, apologies to those of who don't follow Bengali so closely, but he changes the beer with the rashoi to a beer with the dirghoi, because for him it's more in keeping with the Sanskritic veer. So it's an extended V, E, that he's going for, rather than a shorter version of the E. And clearly, we know where that's coming from. Following Khaled's grammar, we have Forster's vocabulary in two parts, English and Bengali and vice versa, that's the name of this work, which appears in 2 volumes. It is significant that it hardly includes any of the Perso-Arabic words that Forster had used with relative freedom in earlier works. So Forster had been writing for the East India Company for a long time. But over time, we can see, if we look at his works, we can see how he's slowly dropping the Perso-Arabic words and bringing in more Sanskritic vocabulary in his texts. Khaled's choice then decided the course of future grammars in the Bengali language. William Carey's, who's a very important scholar and Baptist missionary of the Serampore mission, who we will meet later, and G.C. Houghton's grammars, published in 1801 and 1821 respectively, were consciously modeled on Khaled's work. Through their concerted efforts, then, European scholars proceeded to standardize what they clearly regarded as an irregular dialect. Between 1801 and 1834, several such works were published that established the rule of Sanskrit over the Bengali language. Sanskritization took rapid paces around the turn of the 18th century through its application in standard printed works. Commissioned by the East India Company, there appeared 9 Bengali legal texts between 1784 and 1809. And one scholar has traced in these translations a clear attempt to supplant Perso-Arabic legal terms and phrases with Sanskritic equivalents unfamiliar to the terrain of legalistic writing in the language before. And it's absolutely ridiculous if you look at these texts, how the Sanskritized words, they're not really equivalents, as Bhavani Charan was telling us before, because there couldn't be any equivalents, because these are legal terms coming out of Persian law, and if you try to translate that into Sanskritic words, they don't really make sense. And yet, this is what was happening even in the realm of law. And missionaries, of course, they were another important category, very important group of people who we will soon encounter. So these were then the various groups who were engaged in this project of standardization. So what were these changes then? Well, some of them I think we have already talked about. One is the prevalence of Tatshamo, or Sanskrit loan words. These are the characteristics of the New Bengali that was being promoted. Words in rustic or common usage of Perso-Arabic or other alien lineage and following lax orthography, seemingly, were purged. Verbs had to be compounded only out of Tatshamo words. These are all grammatical terms, and I won't go too much into that because it takes us off on a completely linguistic terrain. Sentences were long and complex and ridden with clauses. They were impossible to read, actually, as again we will find out soon. And there was a Sanskritic influence on syntax as well. It's interesting at this point to return to Halhed again. And I just cannot resist these quotes because they're just so very appropriate to our understanding and so very relevant. This is in his preface again. Such of the Hindus as have been connected, he says, with the Musalman courts or offices have generally complimented their masters by compliance with these Perso-Arabic literary innovations. But the Brahmins and all other educated Gentus still adhere with a certain conscientious tenacity to their primeval tongue and have many ancient books written in its purest style. In the course of my design, I have avoided, with some care, the admission of such words as are not natives of this country, and for that reason have selected all my instances from the most authentic and ancient compositions. And that itself tells you what kind of a project that Halhed was involved in. He was this one-man project deciding what the Bengali language would be like. So Shuniti Kumar Chatterjee is a very important Bengali scholar, calls this a doubly artificial grafting of Sanskrit in the new prose style of the time. And he actually shows in his work how this is very different from the living language that was evolving during the period. We now come to the Fort William language to understand how this project was taking a more institutional shape. So we've talked about individual scholars, we've talked about people like Halhed, who of course were very important, but let's look at how this, this became a larger project in which the colonial state was involved and in which, very important institutions like the Fort William College was involved. The people who have here, you have here on this on the slide, William Carey to the left, Baptist missionary scholar. His Baptist mission is set up in Serampore in 1800, and he's a pioneer in the printing of Bengali works and an extremely important person for the Bengali language at this time. He, together with his Pandit Mrityunjay Vidyalankar, who you have seated next to him on his left and to your right, together they initiate a very critical phase in the Serampore Mission Press. And for the Fort William colleges as well, because together they start producing texts for the Fort William College, which bureaucrats, training bureaucrats of the East India Company at the college would be required to read, because vernacular training in the vernacular was an important part of the training of these young bureaucrats. He was also, in fact both of them were also responsible for the production of textbooks for missionary schools, as well as proselytizing literature for the mission. So on all these three different fronts, the Fort William College, for educational purposes and for purposes of proselytization, they teamed up to produce a lot of books, of Bengali books, printed stuff for the time. So then, a distinctive phase in the standardization of Bengali prose writing began with the founding of two institutions in 1800, the Baptist Mission Press and the Fort William College in Calcutta. William Carey, as founding father of the mission and the principal architect of the college's Bengali department, had connections with both. With the establishment of the vernacular press at Serampore from 1800 onwards, which you will remember is the first Bengali printing press set up in the region, had connections with the establishment of pioneering vernacular press at Serampore from 1800 onwards, a series of printed works in the vernacular began to be produced, which had an important bearing on the Bengali language. While most of these publications were tracts and pamphlets meant for proselytization, as I've said, the Serampore Press was also the supplier of textbooks, readers, grammars, and dictionaries to the Fort William College and other educational institutions. The Calcutta School Book Society, and again the Calcutta School Book Society is a very important body during this period for the circulation of educational literature. Also had its publications issuing from the Mission Press. So the conjunction of the need for textbooks for the college and the availability of a printing press at Serampore thus provided the perfect opportunity for the setting of literary standards in Bengali print for the first time. So this is where the institutional dimension kicks in. We have to understand how this was part of a larger process and not just isolated efforts of a few scholars here and there, but this is where the institutional machinery is at work. And just a little detail of information here. We know how the Pundits were important. So it wasn't just Mrityunjay Vidyalanka, but a whole team of Pundits were helping these scholars to standardize Bengali during this period. And to understand how important these Pundits were, I've looked into their records, and it's not surprising to know that one of the biggest items of expenditure for the Baptist mission at Serampore was the paying of the monthly wages of these Pundits. And these poor missionaries, obviously they couldn't afford that much money, and they had to constantly write back to their parent missions back in England saying, we want more money. But a lot of this money was actually being channelized towards the payment of these Pundits, who were very, very expensive, I can tell you. But this language, what they fail to realize is, and it's ridiculous, and it can be the subject of another paper, but this Bengali was just so ridiculous that nobody could actually understand them. This was highly sonorous, artificial Bengali, which completely defeated the purpose because ordinary people couldn't understand that language. And it came to be known as Sahibi Bangla, it came to be ridiculed as Sahibi Bangla. So this is not the Bangla we understand, but this is the Bangla of the Sahibs, of the white man writing this language, which we completely don't understand. And I've published elsewhere, and not in this book, but a very interesting article about how the missionaries were extremely happy that people were taking away their tracts, because wherever they went with their tracts, everyone got them. But they took away their tracts, fine, but it wasn't actually for reading them. And they would turn up at times, in completely different contexts. They were used as wrapping paper in shops. They were used for flying kites. They were used for all kinds of purposes, but for reading. And these poor missionaries don't understand. And they write back, glorifying to the parent societies, glorifying how their activities, and saying how well they were doing and how well they were spreading the word. And they say, but we don't understand. And they were very honest about it, because I found this in Baptist missionary records, not from anywhere else. So they were very honest about it. They do say that this is actually what we found was actually happening. And that's absolutely amazing, because they think, that's an aberration. But if you look at the circulation figures, and you look at other accounts, because you can corroborate this from other sources as well, a lot of this was being spent in this way. So, paper was a very valuable commodity for all other kinds of purposes, not just for reading. So clearly then, this Bengali wasn't working. It wasn't working at all, certainly not for proselytization. But to give you some facts and figures again, very interesting that the Bengali that was being promoted within the school book societies and within the educational field in Bengal actually becomes the standard for Bengali in the region. And between many of these were actually translated into Hindi and Oriya for use in schools in Bihar and Orissa, so that the Bengali books could be seen to be guiding public education in these two states. So over a vast region then, actually the matter, the material that was being published and printed from the mission press was having a greater influence in the region. Just some few facts and figures. Between 1832 and 36, just 4 years, the distribution figures for the school book societies books jumped from 52,243 to 123,844. So that's about from roughly 52,000 to 123,000, and that's just within a period of 4 years. So there's a massive body of this literature that is being produced. I have other figures, but I shan't go into it, but they're all very telling. You just know that a great body of educational literature is being produced. By 1860s, a standard Bengali purged of its syncretic associations, so you know how the language was actually evolving in its natural state before all this interference came in, and modeled strictly on Sanskrit, had established itself under the joint supervision of the colonial state and powerful indigenous groups. Polite Bengali had essentially come into existence to serve the needs of this group, and this is what I argue in my bigger work, which is about how this is actually a process of social engineering. So it's groups who are close to the colonial state, groups who are in power, have a say in the shaping of language. And this is not, you know, it's not unique to the project of Bengali. This is true all over the world. Those with power and dominant groups have a greater say in the shaping of a standardized language, which then, you know, basically comes to dominate the print scene. But these groups have quite a big role to play, and this kind of social engineering is something that we have to look out for and understand, and not take literary tastes as sacrosanct, because you know these literary tastes are actually created, languages are shaped. These are artificial processes, they don't just happen. So, linguistically and socially, therefore, this new Bengali that is being created sought to establish its domination over other variants of the language and the social groups that they represented. And as I've said in my work, I've looked at Meli Bhasha. These are the strands that got, you know, basically marginalized. Meli Bhasha, the colloquial, and Musalmani Bengali. Let's now then turn to Musalmani Bengali and the fate of Musalmani Bengali and what happened to it. And you know, let's trace the fortunes of that language. Sorry, this should have come earlier, but you know, basically I've talked you through this. These are the various institutions that had been at the center of the printing and educational project of the early 19th century. But let's look at the rise of Islamic Bengali, variously also known as Musalmani Bengali, from the mid-19th century onwards. And Shukumar Sen, who's a very important scholar of the Bengali language, says that this was a creation of the 19th century. And he sees this as a mixed lexicon of Persian and Arabic, together with some other words of non-indigenous origin, like Portuguese. And in poetic compositions of the times, this was also known as Dobhashi literature, which is literally two languages. Literary historians trace the origins of Muslim Bengali to the second half of the 19th century. In fact, the first time this term was coined, was in 1855 by James Long, the Reverend James Long, who we briefly met earlier, who, after Carey, is the second most important person within this linguistic project. And he calls it Musalman Bengali. And remember, he's the guy who said that this is the language of the boatmen, and so on. So most hold that the term cannot be used to describe the Bengali of the late Mughal and even the early British period. Shukumar Sen believes that this was a creation of the 19th century, as I have said, and he says that while this was not the standard Bengali, of high literary writings, it was nevertheless employed occasionally to embellish and render lifelike certain themes and ideas. So if you had within a novel, if you had somebody with the Muslim Bengali identity, that person would be made to speak the Islamic Bengali language. It was representative of an administrative and legal as well as a living colloquial vocabulary. Linguistically, however, as I've said, there doesn't seem to be a clear distinction between the Dobhashi Bangla and the Musalmani Bengali. And some of this I think you are already familiar with, the next slide that I turn to. And this is part of, this language has been a part of local literature in Bengal, in the Bengal region for a very, very long time. You have legends like Malua and Bhelua sung in the ballad style in Moymanshing. You have Syed Hamza's works. You have Muslim poets of the Roshan Chittagong area who are also using these traditions. And in fact, and I'll soon come to this, I show how this is still quite in a fluid state because, you know, both kind of linguistic registers are being used. So the poets of the Chittagong area, Roshan Chittagong area, actually end up using Sanskritic Bengali as well, as scholars have shown. And, you know, the Pachalis of the time using very mixed syncretic language. So this is quite an open scribal culture and is a part of popular religion as well. And this is why this becomes very important for us, because the next category or the next genre of works I'll be looking into, the Nasihatnamas, actually end up using this language, and this becomes a very important vehicle for the spread of religious messages. So songs based on local legends like those of Chandramukhi, Bhelua and Malua had been extremely popular in the Bengal region since medieval times. Usually tragic tales of love and betrayal, these were sung or performed by groups of itinerant musicians traveling the countryside. The ballads implicitly underlined the far more vibrant and naturally syncretic nature of the Bengali language as witnessed in these songs. There are in fact many instances of poets being at ease with both styles. Even later on, that is, you know, both the Sanskritic style as well as this Dobhashi style that I'm talking about. Syed Hamza, one of the greatest writers of this genre in the 18th century, composed works in standard literary Bengali of his day. Muslim poets from the Roshan Chittagong area that I was talking about earlier maintained a pure Shadhu style in their writing till as late as the beginning of the 20th century, drawing clear distinctions with the Islamic Bengali style in their title pages. Sorry, I thought you had a question. You raised your hand. No, you didn't. Okay. Ordinary scribes and writers too were free-floating. And I've looked at this in my bigger work as well, in my bigger book project. And I show how even as far as the colloquial language is concerned, whereby, you know, where we are not talking about the Islamic variant, but if you look at medieval ballads from Bengal, this language is very different. It's very early. You know, the folk language is very different from the language that is being promoted by the Pundits around the start of the 19th century. And yet, this is such a rich language, and not to be ignored at all. And most happily for us and for Bottola, this is the language that is promoted by Bottola when its earliest publications are being produced, because, you know, they're very canny businessmen. They know this is the language that is going to sell. They're not going to be, you know, as stupid as the missionaries were, because for them money matters and for them readership matters. And this is why it's not surprising their print runs are, you know, 3,000, 2,000, sometimes 4,000 as compared to the Bottola print runs, which are around 500. So, you know, if you compare the print runs of the books being published in the highbrow presses and the Bottola presses, you can see the difference. And the earliest publications that come out of the Bottola presses are all, you know, basically a printing of the manuscripts that were circulating for such a long time, the folk legends, the ballads, and so on that people were reading. They continue to shape the same and feed the same literary audience. So ordinary scribes and writers too were free-floating in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Thus Muslim scribes copied epics like the Ramayana for their own reading pleasure, and you have evidence of this, while Hindu poets composed works such as Imam-e-Ketcha and the Jaunama. Songs and pachalis of the folk-based syncretic Peer traditions, such as those dedicated to Shottapir or Shottanarayan, Ghazi Kalu and Manik Pir, were composed in a lively East Bengali dialect with its naturalized share of Perso-Arabic words, and intended for both Hindu, and this is very important, for both Hindu and Muslim audiences. In their dialects and literary repertoire, the Pir Pachalis echoed the East Bengali ballads. So this is the fluid linguistic world that we encounter in the folk literature of the times. And we see how, subsequently, and I'll go on to talk about it, we see how, on the one hand, while a Sanskritic Bengali is being shaped for Hindus, 1870s onwards, there's a Muslim search for self-identity, and this Perso-Arabic language, dominated vocabulary and language, is actually picked up and promoted by religious leaders, particularly in the Nasihatnamas, to popularize their messages, because this is the most important vehicle, they think, for the popularization of the messages, and therefore this is the language that they pick up. This is very Perso-Arabic in its orientation, and very, within quotes, Islamic in its orientation, because the earlier language, the syncretic language, is no longer fulfilling the needs or the drive for self-identity that is being felt by Muslims 1870s onwards. And a very important scholar who has worked in this area, and this is not my work, is Rafiuddin Ahmed, who I pick on in order to help you understand how there was a parting of ways for the Bengali language. So on the one hand you have the Hindu-Sanskritized Bengali, and on the other hand you have the Perso-Arabic vocabulary kind of becoming the banner of Muslim self-identity late 1870s onwards. How am I doing for time? All right. There isn't a great deal left, so we're reaching the end now. So let's move on to the Nasihatnamas, and this is a very important genre for us when we are talking about this bifurcation. Hunter, who's a very important, W.W. Hunter, who's a very important official and ethnographer of the time, thinks that it's the Wahhabi movement in Lower Bengal and the circulation of religious literature or Nasihatnamas which led to the popularization of the Perso-Arabic strand in the Bengali language. Rafiuddin Ahmed, the scholar I had been referring to earlier, thinks that the Islamic way of life fused with the consciously styled Bengali that had more Perso-Arabic and Urdu words, and these are to be found in the Nasihatnamas. Sukumar Sen, the other literary scholar that I have been talking about from time to time, thinks that the Musalmani Bangla was the Maulavi's reply to the Pundits' Shatubasha of the early and middle part of the 19th century. So just to showcase to you the different, different opinions of scholars on this version of the language that shapes up 1870s onwards. The end of the 19th century saw much opposition to un-Islamic local practices, and printed Nasihatnamas or manuals of religious instruction of the later reformists of this period worked hard to reverse the trend. And this here I'm entirely relying on Ahmed's work, because this is not something I have researched, but what I have looked at in my work is actually the Musalmani Bengali literature that was being printed by Bhattala, and I've particularly looked at romances, I've not looked at religious literature, to see how these were articulating very different mentalities and very different attitudes, which were a complete counterpoint to the Bhattulok literature, because my interest is in other areas, so I looked at secular literature in my book. But what Ahmed says is very important for us. Cheaply sold and in mass circulation, they purported to carry the true message of Islam, urging Muslims to return to a more Islamic code of conduct. By the start of the 20th century, the syncretic practices of the countryside were on the decline. A contemporary noted this with some satisfaction in his memoirs, and I quote, "Earlier Muslims used to participate in a lot of un-Islamic recreations, but then on, Muslims stopped visiting Hindu households to watch jatras and hear Panchali songs. Hindus had also been used to receiving subscriptions from Muslims for public entertainment, like Durga Puja, which both groups used to subscribe to, on Hindu religious occasions. However, even these had stopped altogether in more recent times." So this was something that contemporary records in records for us is very telling. So great was the influence of the Perso-Arabic vocabulary that verbs were compounded out of Perso-Arabic words, and this is where I think what Sen says comes in very, very handy and very relevant for understanding what this backlash was like. So this is pretty much what Sanskrit had done to the Bengali of the Hindu Pundits, was being done in a reverse fashion for the Musalmani Bengali. That is, the influence of Perso-Arabic takes over the living version of the language. And here, this is what we find. We find that great was this influence of the Perso-Arabic vocabulary that verbs were being compounded out of Perso-Arabic words and even used as prefixes and suffixes in the language. To further highlight the identification, the usual left-to-right pattern of the Bengali script was reversed to follow the Persian and Arabic style of writing from right to left. To maintain consistency, even the printed or manuscript pages of Musalmani Bengali works were bound in the opposite direction. So if you look at tracts from that period, they are so that a book would read like that. So that would be the top cover, and your page one would be here as you turn the page. So books would open up and read from right to left. The idea was to make what was seen to be a generally un-Islamic language more acceptable as a medium of religious propaganda. This, Ahmed holds, was in sharp contrast to the Nasihatnamas of an earlier epoch, whose mode of expression was generally as Bengali as the work of any contemporary Hindu author. Educated Muslims, however, and here the class dimension comes in, and this is the dimension that interests me most, even in my wider work. I'm very interested in the class dimension. Educated Muslims were disdainful of this pidgin Bengali, what they saw as pidgin Bengali, and condemned them to the realm of Bottala Puthis. And again, it's interesting that the same term, Bottala Puthis, is being used by both Hindu and Muslim groups to condemn this genre altogether. So concerned was the elite population that official efforts to invent an exclusive language for the Muslims of Bengal on the basis of so concerted was the elite opposition that official efforts to invent an exclusive language for the Muslims of Bengal on the basis of Musalmani Bengali fell through, as elite Bengali Muslims considered it to be inappropriate for use in genteel society. For the elite Bengali Muslims had always identified with Persian and Arabic or Urdu rather than Bengali, and this again is a very interesting dynamic for me, which was perceived as the language of the masses. So the Bengali was the language of the masses, but not Persian and Arabic, or even Urdu. The linguistic divide was thus split along lines of class rather than religion. While religious sentiments and official propaganda coalesced to label the once syncretic Bengali as Islamic or Musalmani, the Sanskritized version of the vernacular secured for itself an unmistakably Hindu essence. The institution of such communal divides represented not just a passing phase in the history of the vernacular. Apart from shaping the separate identities of the two communities in Bengal in the post-independence era, their indelible impact can be seen in current manifestations of the languages in Bangladesh and West Bengal today. Thank you.
We've got time for questions now. What about 15 minutes?
Do you think I should stand because I might not be visible at the back? It's all right, I can stand.
I think you like it.
Yeah. You take it.
Yes. Oh, here.
Oh, thank you, Anindita. That was really, I've learned a lot from that. Your work kind of reminded me of Joy Chatterjee's Bengal Divided, and her arguments about how the events of 1935, the communal war, how that sort of led up to the division, partition of Bengal. I was wondering if I find your work also somewhat contributed to that partition discourse in the sphere of language, and how, I mean, I see a very clear line and how these communities sort of started to rift, and how, if I'm not mistaken, you argue the politics of language making or Bengali or Sanskritization sort of contributed or may contribute to the discourse of partition of 47 of the Bengal.
I wasn't taking it that far because obviously Joya's concern is for a much later period. I was more interested in the linguistic sphere, and religion is just one thing that I'm interested in. I'm also interested in class. I'm more concerned with language rather than communal identity, although it's quite clear that crops up for the period. My project stops around 1905, so that might give you an idea of where I picked this off. But yes, I don't see how Joy and I are contradicting each other. I think it's the same narrative, except that I don't have much knowledge of her period because my own research stops at 1905, and I'm sure there are other factors as well that need to be brought in for the 1930s. That Joy would be able to better tell you.
Yeah, but surely your work does contribute towards the identity formation that started much before that.
Oh yes.
And it sort of narrates the period through the politics of language of that 1800s and 1900s.
Yeah, but the one thing I think we are quite not sure of is how we can apply the term communal that early. I don't think this was consciously a communal project. I think what I'm trying to do is show how historical processes shaped, certain historical processes, or the way historical processes shaped the destiny of the Bengali language. I don't think this was specifically communal. And in fact, even in the 1870s, the search for self-identity that Rafiuddin Ahmed talks about isn't really communal in that sense, even though that is certainly also at work. So I think 1930s brings in a completely different set of factors. But overall, I think Joy and I have the same narrative, even though I would hesitate to apply the term communal for my period.
I think
Thank you. I have two questions. The first one, I'm fascinated by Halhed. I'm sure this, of course you are. Where was he coming from? Because every school child in this country learns that beef came from the Normans, the word for beef, right? Comes from boeuf, and we learned the etymology of English words and how it's influenced by the Anglo-Saxons and the Normans and everyone else. So what made him think that there should be a pure, unadulterated version of Bengali? So sort of the context on that. And then the second question, I'd like to learn more about the Meli Bhasha. I don't know if I missed it when I went out for a phone call, but if you...
No, I didn't talk
okay,
about
I'd love to hear more about that.
I have a whole chapter in the book about Meli.
Okay, thank you.
It's not asking you to go buy my book, but
no,
what I'm saying is, I do. This is one of the chapters that I concern myself with in that project.
I'll read the book, but now maybe the intersection between class and gender.
I would definitely like to comment about that. Okay. To begin with, I don't think Halhed was particularly bothered about explaining etymology, although it's quite clear that his inspiration comes from the Orientalist scholars of the time, for whom Sanskrit was the lingua franca of ancient India. So that's the connection he's making, but he doesn't bother to explain the etymology. Carey to a certain extent does, but Halhed not so much, because he's quite convinced that he's doing the right thing, as we can see through his working papers. That is the mentality which is at work. The other question, which is about gender and
class, the Meli Bhasha
and class. Again, this is the same kind of narrative of how social groups who are in power, which obviously men, have a very clear agenda of shaping a kind of self-respect for the Bengali Bhadralok. So this is kind of the genteel literary Bhadralok, and this is self-image that they create of themselves, which is in a sense very artificial, and in the process of the creation of this genteel language, they displace the burden of the colloquial onto women and lesser social groups. So this is part of that bigger process of the shifting of the burden, even though quite clearly men also spoke that language. But in accounts of the period, not just from your European scholars, but even Bengali reformists of the time and linguists of the time, this is not the language we speak. This is the language of the Antopu. Okay. This is the language that women speak. It's idiomatic, it's irrational. This is very different from the language of the modern prose of the reformists, Vidyasagar and Ramon, So this is the language that matters because it has an agenda, and it's a language we can be proud of. So Bengali is shaped into this vehicle of, larger social discourses of the time, which Bengalis can be proud of. So they have nothing to do with Meli Bhasha. But the interesting thing, of course, is that this is in the very late 19th century. These are precisely the strands that come back into literary writing, because the Bhadralok realized the inauthenticity of their own project. They realized that they can't be speaking for the masses if they're not speaking their language. So it's interesting to see in the late 19th century how all these strands actually come back, but not the Musalmani Bengali.
Thank you. I had a question about this very Sanskritic Bengali that you were talking about and its history later in the 19th century. I was wondering if you can speak a little bit about how it may relate to Arya ideology and the idea of reformists, certainly elsewhere in India. I'm aware of the reorientation along sort of these very Sanskritic principles is what's required for India's reawakening.
Yeah.
The relationship between Arya ideology and the Sanskritic Bengali, if you have anything to say about that.
Yeah, it's not something that I have found linguists consciously talk about in the prefaces to the works or the works that I have looked at. It's clearly at the back of their minds because they're taking on the model that is being produced by the Orientalist scholars of the time, people like Hallett and Max Muller and so on. So a whole range of that body of works is inspiring them. This is the identity that they want to pick up. So yes, they're working along those lines, even though the linguists, I don't think they concern themselves very visibly with that discourse. But this is the discourse that they're working it. There's no denial of that.
Could you give some examples of Nasihatnamas? That's one. And second one is, when did this writing of Bengali from right hand side to left hand side and binding on the right hand side, did it ever start? And if it did, when did it get disbanded?
Okay, the first is I don't have any examples of Nasihatnamas with me today.
By name?
Well, I honestly, it's not something I have. I referred to some works, didn't I? Or maybe they're not here, but there's no doubt that this is a very big body of literature, which is dominating this period. And Rafiuddin Ahmed's work, I think, would be the best. I can channel you in that direction because this is not something I have worked with. But it's well known and it's a big body of literature. To your second question, I think this is about the 1860s, 1870s onward that we find the binding of the book in that fashion. Even though I think you would find isolated examples in the 1850s, but this is also, we don't know if this had happened earlier because 1850s onwards is the period that we are actually tracing the publishing industry and you have records of it. Prior to 1850s, you don't have that many records. I wouldn't know if it had happened earlier on, but because of the fact that 1850s onwards, we have very good records of these publications. It's possible they had existed earlier, but for me, I've been able to trace them only from that period.
And when
did it stop is a very good question. I don't know whether, even up to the early 20th century, and I've looked at old bookshops in Calcutta, and I've found works of this kind being printed even in the early 20th century. Maybe, some of you can tell me. I don't know when it's
I can interrupt and tell you about the Nasihatnamas.
Oh, good.
Nasihatnamas are a body of literature. They were produced by the people who wrote wills. The Muslim property is to be divided into what can wife get, what can the children get, what can the nephews get and the nieces get. And if nobody left any boys, then the distribution was completely different according to the Quran. And these used to be written by the munshis or the solicitor-like people. They were called muhoris. So these Nasihatnamas were not books, they were wills, and which were collected later on to see how Muslim Bengali developed.
But this is also didactic literature, isn't it? It's the spreading of religious messages.
What this doctor is dealing with is the early time. We didn't have colleges and academies at that time. We had tolls. Tolls were the schools, little schools, where there were few students, and the tolls were run by one Brahman. One Brahman used to run a toll, and he had a few people. Same way the munshi, one munshi used to teach in a mosque, and few students. So we didn't have academies or Oxford and Cambridges at that time. That was 1900 and early time. And when before the division of Bengal, even before the division of Bengal into two parts, that is the period this doctor is dealing with. So these schools were tolls and maktabs, not schools and colleges. And that's why you don't have a great big body of literature. You have a small body of literature, but definitely there were the strands of Muslim, how Bengali was being developed under the Muslims, the way the Bengali language was developing in the tolls under the Brahmins. And then there were the missionaries who come in with their printing machines. And this gentleman who wrote the first Bengali grammar book, he was a missionary man. He wanted to know the language, and he had two munshis. He had an Arabic Persian munshi teaching him Bengali, the Muslim version of Bengali, and then he had another munshi, a Hindu gentleman, who was teaching him the Sanskritized Bengali. So, and he was pretty confused, very confused, poor fellow.
To move on, any questions?
Can I just add to that? I think two things. One is Khaled was not a missionary, but he was helped by the two people that you mentioned. And the second is that the Nasihatnamas were also very instructive and didactic, so they would tell people how to lead the true Islamic way of life. I thought what you meant was you wanted examples, didn't you? You wanted titles of Nasihatnamas.
Nasihatnamas were ways.
Yeah, but they have specific titles. So Nasihatnamas would have come by name, they would have titles. I wouldn't have titles, but they are very instructive, didactic literature, telling how a true Muslim should lead his own life.
We go to Deepak.
Thank you for the talk. It's extremely educational. But I just want to ask you, Warren Hastings' role, because he played a very significant role at that time, and he was a Farsi scholar, and he knew about Portuguese very well. Why? And even Mills, when he's criticizing Warren Hastings, he praised that he knows the Bengali people, ordinary people, and he knows the culture of the thing. Why did he get involved? Because all these people are his associates, Khaled and others. They're all from Warren Hastings. Why did he do that? Is it mainly because building of Calcutta as a capital? He wanted to urbanize the whole thing? What is the motive for developing Bengali language? He supported to bring all these pundits to come together. So what is the significance for Warren Hastings? Why did he do this?
Okay, good question. I think for this we have to just step out of the project of the Bengali language a little and look at the wider project that Hastings was involved in, because he's the pioneer of Orientalist scholarship in India. And this is to do with the political economy of the East India Company, which decided to invest in the Indian people for purposes of trade. So Orientalist scholarship itself should be seen as stemming out of the political economy of the period, and Bengali is just part of that. So it is important to know the local languages in order to administer them well, in order to get to know them well, because it's good for commerce and good for trade. So Hastings, in his capacity as the Governor General of Bengal, brings in this scholarship, brings in this whole body of scholars. Bengali is just part of it. So that is, Hastings is coming in from he wasn't an altruist, even though I think people imagine him to be, but he was coming in as an administrator, because this is why he had been vested with that power, and he had to do
14 years before he got the responsibility. He was in India for 14 years before he got the East India Company's responsibility.
Which is why perhaps he was the best man to do the East India Company job, because this is what the East India Company wanted to invest in at that time. So this is part of, we have to appreciate that Bengali was part of that wider project. And learning not just Bengali but other local languages were also important for the purposes of revenue collection and commerce and trade and so on. So once again, which is why the involvement of the colonial state is so important. And as a historian, that is very important for us, instead of just looking at Bengali language in isolation, but to see it as part of historical developments and processes. So that's my answer to your question.
We're running out of time. We'll take 3 questions and we together.
Yeah.
First Kamul, then you,
Thank you for your talk. Are there any opposition of this artificial construction? I heard there are some opposition within the scholars and pundits. They tried to reverse the situation of they created literature against this artificial construction. Are there any examples, or are there any opposition of this artificial construction?
Do you want me to take all the questions?
This lady.
You talked about the syncretic tradition of Bengali in the 18th century and then how it got split along class lines and religious lines. And I appreciate your research stops in 1905 or around that period, and this lady over here spoke about somebody whose research stops in the 1930s. But I was wondering, given that Bangladesh was founded in the 1970s on specifically secular lines, whether there was any research that looked at how that's affected the language.
I think that's where the earlier speaker can come in, who's worked on this. What was her name? Nazneen, was it?
Yeah,
she's worked on. She can perhaps tell you more about that. This is specifically what this is what I just know from the way she's described on your program. She's perhaps not here. You are. Maybe you can respond to that later on.
Later, yeah.
I can talk to you.
But her work is very specifically related to your question.
I think we just go to this lady.
Thank you for your fascinating talk. I'm so sorry I arrived late, it was unavoidable. But I wonder if you touched on Rabindranath Tagore, and I'm particularly interested in his Sanskritized Gitanjali. And one thing that intrigues me, I've got here a copy of his original manuscript in his own handwriting. It's in Bangla and in English. And one thing that intrigues me is his own self-censoring on what is probably the only political verse in Gitanjali, where the mind is without fear. And bearing in mind that the verse was written in 1900, and he translated it in 1912, so Bengal was partitioned by the British in 1905, after ructions, unpartitioned in 1911. So when he came to London in 1912, the invitation of William Robinstein, he wasn't sure what to bring of his work, so he brought some of his poems, translated them on the way. And so his original translation of this verse was, where the mind is, I'll just read out the first sentence, where the mind is without fear and the head is held high, where knowledge is free, where the world has not been partitioned by narrow domestic walls. Now, he has in his own handwriting crossed out the word partitioned, which is very, very interesting because he wished to sell the concept of his poetry to Britain in 1912. And he's altered it, the word partitioned, to the world has not been frittered into fragments. Now, Yeats fine-tuned...
Sorry, the word has not been...
the word has not been frittered into fragments.
Okay.
But that was slightly fine-tuned in the English publication because Yeats fine-tuned it and arranged the publication. He selected 103 of the verses. So Yeats fine-tuned that to has not been broken into fragments. But very interesting that in Tagore's own handwriting, I don't know whether his son Rathi might have said, oh look Dad, this is too sensitive, whether it might have been Yeats, because he was a very anglicised Irishman, whether it was Tagore himself. So it's intriguing what actually drove him to cross that out and amend it.
Can I take this question first and then I'll come back to you? I think you're absolutely right. It's possibly because you found the word very politically sensitive for the period, because it was coming in 1912 and the partition had been annulled in 1911. So I would imagine, I don't know whether this was somebody like his son advising him or whether he had done it himself. But it's interesting to see, I mean, that itself is quite interesting for us to see how particular choice of words is very much shaped by contemporary politics. And we have to be aware of that because we kind of take literary texts for granted and languages for granted, but to actually look at what all went on into the shaping of these literary texts and languages becomes very important for us. I did not talk about Tagore because I think, and this is a question I think that has been asked of me earlier when I talked to people about Bengali language as to why I don't talk about Tagore. But that's because Tagore requires he needs to be looked at in his entirety and on his own. He's such a colossal figure.
Yeah.
But Tagore's works, of course, also are very central to this whole process that I'm talking about. which is about, particularly around the time that he's writing at the turn of, the start of the 20th century, end of 19th, start of the 20th century. This is when romantic nostalgia is feeding the literature of the period. This is the time that the folk elements of Bengali literature come back into Bengali, and this is being celebrated. This is something that Bengali should be proud of. Tagore is part of this tradition, even though, of course, he is, he's not somebody that one would talk about in the same breath as Bhaktal, of course, but this is a very selective bringing back of certain strands within mainstream Bengali in order to give it the authenticity, in order to give it the strength to fight the colonial critique. And it's, other scholars have shown how, literary scholars as well, how actually within this newly formed language in the early 20th century, there is a lot of scope for a critique of the colonial state and of westernization in particular, which is done through the language of the ordinary people. So the colloquial becomes the vehicle for anti-colonial critique. Because the Bhadralok's refined language can't do it anymore, because it's seen as fake, it's seen as inauthentic, because the Bhadralok is reliant on the colonial state for power. Sorry, I've gone off into political history again. But to come back to literary writings of the period, this is why Tagore is very important for us, because as we know, he also experiments with language in such a fashion as to make these folk elements very important for us. So from that point of view, he's extremely important, absolutely. To go back to your question, there isn't any opposition that, I don't think I talked about any opposition in those terms, but I talked about the Bhattala press, which invested in completely different form of Bengali, which wasn't bothered with mainstream standardized Bengali at all. And and what I'm arguing is this press mattered and its publications mattered because of its sheer volume. Because in terms of numbers, it is much more representative of the people than the Bhadralok press. And one wouldn't have thought of this before, because we wouldn't take it seriously. We would just sideline this or marginalize this literature, saying it wasn't worthy of study. But it is worthy of study because it helps us understand the social history of the period and the representative politics of these various groups who are reading this literature for the period. So this is to say that print doesn't just standardize, but print also opens up the possibilities of larger groups of people, because these presses were very cheap. With very little money, you could just set up a press in Bhattala and you could print thousands and become rich overnight. And I've found accounts of shopkeepers having second-story houses. Can you imagine? In the mid-19th century, 1860s, 1870s. So they must have done very well to be able to build big houses like that. So these are printer entrepreneurs who know that they have a social role to play, apart from the fact, of course, they're also capitalizing on the market, because there is such a big market for these works.
Thank you very much. I hope you found it stimulating and interesting. We're going to have a short break, but don't go, because we got our two best presentation yet left, right? So have 10 minutes break, and then you can buy some tea, coffee there, have some water or whatever. See you in 10 minutes time.